So I'll do that right now, and then I'll return to the slide. Okay. All right. So this is just a kind of summation of the major upshots, the major philosophical upshots to take from the symposium. So this imagistically kind of controverts the latter form, given that we're moving from the top and going down, but just try to ignore that. So this is like the bottom rung of the ladder, right? So by this account, your lustful, perhaps obsession with the beauty or attractiveness or charm of an individual person, typically associated in adolescence with the bodily presence of that individual, is then understood here to be a stepping stone. And as we mentioned last time, as the beginning, it's a beginning to be built upon and to be evolved out of, but in that capacity, it's nothing that is abandoned. It's for that reason then important. We shouldn't dismiss one's recognition of bodily beauty and one's preoccupation with that either as negligible or entirely uninteresting or worthless. And that becomes a stepping stone to recognizing that beauty is always more than one limited thing. And that happens perhaps if you by chance encounter another beautiful body. And maybe that will be an occasion in which to compare the qualities or properties that resonated with you in terms of the first body as beautiful, to see how they can show up in other bodies in a not necessarily localized way. And then your appreciation of many different bodies is now a stepping stone to recognizing that since bodies in general, not just this or that person whom you might be attracted to or love, but human bodies in general grow old and eventually perish, eventually pass away. And for that reason, we're dealing with finitude in the case of physical beauty. But when it comes to the soul, we find a source of perhaps infinite beauty, beauty that's more enduring and therefore superior. And so the beauty of the soul, which we can understand using the etymology of the word psychic, from the Greek word psyche for soul, your appreciation of psychic beauty, that is the beauty of souls, the beauty of what souls can bring forth, is a stepping stone to recognizing that ideas created by souls in art, as we're discussing here, are, because they're not bodily, because they're connected to the immortal aspect of each personage, insofar as we're talking about human individuals. And Plato gives plenty of arguments, not any of which are ultimately very satisfying, but in the dialogue, the Phaedo, Plato has Socrates employ a number of arguments to conclude that the soul is in fact separable from the body, the one being immortal and the other being mortal or finite. So the soul, of course, being the immortal entity. And so the products which can be manifest through creations within the milieu or membrane of beauty, the kind of medium of beauty, are institutions. And we can understand the art world, for example, as a kind of enduring institution that gathers individuals from various generations together in certain projects or enactments. And so your appreciation of beautiful, let's see, oh, we're still at this level. So then we're talking about ideas. Well, what are these ideas? We're talking about ideas that can be produced by souls in general, not simply this or that soul. So these ideas can be preserved in such institutions, an example of which I presented in the form of the art world. But we can talk about legal institutions, political institutions, other social and cultural ones beyond art. And these institutions, insofar as they do gather individuals representing different historical generations together, are more enduring than discrete individual human lives, which are in every instance subject to decay and eventually perishing. So then your appreciation of beautiful institutions, such as art, legal codes, moral codes, institutions, even social institutions, even such as marriage and so forth, various rituals that we engage in that ground us as a society or a culture. Your appreciation of these beautiful institutions becomes a stepping stone to many more beautiful ideas. And this is an important upshot that resonates, I think, well with our current cultural recognition of the importance of social justice, for example, as an ideal state to which we aspire as a collective or a community, but in reality, we have never achieved, right? So when you see then these beautiful institutions and the beautiful ideas that gave birth to them, you can see how the existing institutions, which are grounded in and in a sense ground themselves your culture, community, or society, you can see how there's something missing, right? So there's something missing that you can aspire to fill in. And you can notice that things aren't exactly how they ought to be, how they should be, morally speaking, aesthetically speaking, in accordance with these ideas that have not entirely been realized. You're in a position to do this only when, at the highest rung of the ladder, you can apprehend the form of kalon, kalon being the Greek word for beauty or the beautiful, in itself, by itself. So that's what we mean by absolute beauty. So the adjective absolute, sometimes put forth as a noun as well, absolute means essentially non-relational, right? So when we talk about beautiful objects, we often do so relativistically or comparatively. So we'll say, oh, this rose is beautiful and I apprehend its specific beauty in contradistinction to maybe the ugly weed that it's sitting next to, right? So we compare things and we say, object A is more beautiful than object B, or object A is more just or better than, in terms of goodness, object B. So that's dealing with the manifestation or instantiation in human experiential life relatively or relativistically. By contrast, though, when you arrive at the highest rung of this ladder, at beauty with a capital B, the form, the eidos of beauty. So eidos is the Greek word that gets translated to form. And we still preserve this word in some English language senses, such as the technical word for photographic memory is an eidetic memory. So if one has an eidetic memory, that means one can look at a page, for example, of written text and just grasp it in its wholeness, in its entirety, as a singular form marked by various properties, such that you have a photographic image of that text preserved that you can draw on and thus remember the particular lines or language that show up therein.
Good question.
Yeah, sure.
Would like parenthood fall in an institution in terms of like seeing the beauty in another and being attracted to them for their like parental instincts?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you recognize, for example, what a good father is doing or what a good mother is doing with their children in a particular situation, you are somehow recognizing, observing a specific material instance of a universal form. So you're saying, oh, this is an example of a good parent, what a good mother or what a good father would do. And I know that because I have some prior, even if it's implicit, even if it's not fully articulated or reflected in my consciousness, I have a prior attunement to or understanding of parenthood as such. You might call it like a form, the form that would exemplify any good parent. So the insight here, and I like the example that you suggested here, because it shows us the truth that we all recognize in some way, that if you find a good parent, a mother or father, then insofar as that person is a good parent, the way in which they are a good parent is more or less interchangeable with any other good parent, right? So what a good parent does is not peculiar to this or that parent. It's more or less what any good parent would do. So any good parent knows they have to provide their child with food, shelter, sustenance, emotional
Discipline.
support, discipline, right? Yet there are wildly diverse ways in which parents can go wrong, right? In which parents can miss the mark, as it were.
And create a living hell.
Yeah. So you can have an infinite variety of deformation, so bad forms, deformed parenting. But there's really only a set number of ideal forms that would reflect, in particular instances, acts of good parenting, right? So that's a good example of an institution. So that's when you would see, you say, oh, this is a great mother. And you recognize something good about what this individual does as a mother, but ascending that ladder because, in a sense, the goodness of her acts of motherhood are charming to you. They attract you. You want to be around this person. But as you ascend the ladder, you realize that the goodness that's reflected in the acts of this particular mother exceed or go beyond the specific temporal and spatial confines in which this mother is living as a mother and interacting with children and so forth. Does that make sense? Okay. And so the form, eidos, originally prior to Plato's technical alteration of it, his appropriation of it for his own philosophy, eidos in the Greek just meant that observable quality by which any given thing is immediately recognized as the thing that it is. So if you walk into a dark room, you see a chair in the corner, you say, oh, there's a chair. You might not even think that directly, you just implicitly know that there's a chair in the room. So if you want to sit down, you'll be able to do so or whatever. But the moment you register, perhaps, that there is a chair, you have somehow captured the eidos of that object, the sensible form in accordance with which it is what it is, that is a chair and not a platypus or a ham sandwich. But Plato's transformation of this fairly straightforward Greek term was pretty remarkable in that now the true eidos is nothing observable. It's nothing that's manifest as an empirical quality, such as the color of an object or the size, the weight, the sound it produces. These material components rather point you in the direction of the form which is supersensible. It's beyond sensation. So the individual examples of beauty or goodness or justice or whatever are available to us through sensory observation, but the form itself as an objective existent exceeds, in fact, all of those dimensions by which we are in a sensory way opened up to the object, such that the form of a chair exceeds the specificity of the material dimensions in which this particular object that you encounter in the course of your experience shows up. And so here she's talking about, Diotima is talking about the perfect form of beauty. So as the perfect form, it's nothing that you can encounter that is the perfect form of beauty. It's nothing you can encounter through your senses, but it's the very condition of possibility by which such exemplary beauties can be perceived and experienced and engaged with. So when I perceive the dogwood flowers that are blooming outside my window as beautiful, the specific object, the material thing that's outside my window, this physical flower, is rather a pointer to the higher form of beauty in which it's manifested or in which it shows itself. And if I am able to attune myself to the higher form of beauty that exceeds these specific flowers, I'm able to see how it is that something like a flower is relatable is in some measure the same as something entirely different, like a sunset or a song or a beautiful woman or a beautiful man or a sports car or something like that, because they are all different, but what makes them the same is the way that they share in the form that is the eidos of beauty in itself. Okay, so does that make sense? That was just wrapping up. That was just to wrap up the symposium. And then there's just a couple slides now to build up the background for the fully mature mimetic theory of art that Aristotle articulates. So are there any final questions about the symposium dialogue or the form of beauty? No? Okay. Well, if any come up, as usual, just feel free to interrupt. Just jump in. Okay. So let's talk about the sophist just a little bit. So last time, Bennett in particular walked us through some questions regarding this dialogue. And so we clarified who the sophist is historically. So there are these traveling teachers of rhetoric who are paid by aristocrats, so Greeks of high station throughout the Hellenic world, to prepare their children for social and political lives of social and political power and success. But we don't really care for our present purposes, since we're talking about art and beauty, we don't really care so much about the sophist. But this is an important point because it's something that Aristotle will use, a method. So in the dialogue, Plato has this character who's referred to only as the stranger, lead Theaetetus, so another character, through a process known as the method of division in English. And the Greek word for this is diaresis. And it's a strategy by which we can arrive at rigorous truths, that is definitions of things. And definition is another way to translate logos. So we're trying to get the logos that underscores the real, that tells us, in other words, through our act of uncovering, through inquiry, what the truth is about any particular matter. And so diaresis, or the method of division, works by starting with the most generic or general concept as a whole, and then dividing it, as the name suggests, until you arrive at the most specific framing or definition of the phenomenon in question that's possible, right? So you start with big picture, and you make a cut or a division, and then you have a smaller picture, you make another cut and division, until you arrive at that which cannot be divided anymore, and it's what you really want to define, what you were seeking after in the first place. And so that's how the stranger, working with Theaetetus in this dialogue, is able to achieve the formal logos or definition of the sophist. But we don't care about that definition. What we really care about instead is how diaresis, this method of division, allows us to arrive at other definitions, in particular for creation, which is poiesis. So another word for creation is production, which is usually how poiesis is translated. And remember, that's the originary word from which we get poetry. And then also imitation. We want to get a rigorous, clear, systematic definition of mimesis, or imitation. So on page 45, the stranger says, we divided image making, and so that's a translation of mimesis, into two sorts. The one, likeness making, and the other, imaginative or fantastic. And so that's deriving from fantasy, which is a translation of the Greek word fantasia. But we're all more or less clear, I think, what we mean by fantasy, right? Fantasy doesn't necessarily have to involve mental images, but it can. But for the present purposes, that's this kind of point of distinction between likeness making, which is necessarily imagistic, and fantastic, which isn't in every instance tied up with particular images. So some mimesis is likeness making. That is, we're making a likeness of something, some object, a representation. So like painting, for example, you can paint a portrait of someone, in which case it'll be a likeness of that person. Or landscape, it will be a likeness of the scene in front of you. And the same goes for sculpture. You can sculpt various bodies as representations of already existing bodies, which are the model or the original. And then some mimesis is imaginative or fantastic. And so this could be a confusing point. So that would be like poetry or music, which isn't necessarily likeness producing in the way that the pictorial or plastic arts are, such as sculpture and painting. So does that make sense, what these two kinds of mimesis would be, or image making? So in poetry or music, if you produce musical sounds, it might be obscure or difficult to figure out what exactly is being imitated, what exactly is being represented. And the same goes less straightforwardly as a problem for poetry, but it's still a kind of issue. So it's pretty obvious then how a painting or a sculpture can be mimetic or imitative, but it's a little more unclear how it is that music, for example, can be. So that's why the stranger makes this distinction. But Aristotle will actually help us clarify how music or poetry or theater in particular can be mimetic, even if we're dealing with fictions, right? So that's what we'll talk about a little bit later today. Okay, and then on page 46, for imitation or mimesis is a kind of creation, and creation is translated from poiesis, of images, however, as we affirm, not of real things. So what this means is an artist creates mimetically by painting an image of a horse. So a representation of a horse, but the result is an image, not an actual horse that you can ride, for example. And so Sam last time helped us out with this point by giving us that famous Magritte painting of the pipe that pronounced, at the same time it was showing itself as a pipe, this is not a pipe. And that's to make this kind of point that had been put forth by Plato thousands of years before, that we're getting clarity on at this point. Right? So of course the painting is an image of a pipe, not the actual pipe, not something that you could light and puff on. Right? Okay. And then we get a definition or a logos of creativity, or poiesis. So every power which causes things to exist, not previously existing, was defined by us as creative, or poietike is the adjective there. As such, and here we're following that method of division. So we start at this point with poiesis, creation, and now we're trying to divide that further. So creation can be divided into human creation, as we saw the stranger do in the sophist, and divine creation. So when it comes to human creation, we're talking about artifacts, works of art, products of industry, or whatever else. So hammers, pants, houses, boats, ice cream sandwiches, earrings, poems, whatever. And then there's divine creation. And the stranger says, in this case, we're talking about all the animals and plants, things which grow upon the earth, from which seeds and roots and so forth. So that quotation is cut off there because I just wanted to show you the important part. So divine creation is everything that we humans draw on or can possibly use in our own efforts of human creation, right? So the rocks and minerals and so forth that we stumble over, inorganic existing entities, are still in some way created by the divine, which we can then draw on to produce sculpture or tools or whatever else. But here's an interesting point, just as a kind of aside though. Plato, in the way he writes this piece, has the stranger reject the idea that it's not the gods, it's not the divine that produces what we characterized here as that of divine creation, but physis, nature. So physis is the Greek word for nature, from which we get physical, physics, and so forth. He rejects this idea that natural forces simply produce these entities that we ascribe to nature without any thought, without any purpose or plan. It just sort of happens. He rejects this idea. And in so doing, he's rejecting the idea of evolution, which through the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles had antedated Darwinian theory by thousands of years, right? So Empedocles, a fantastic pre-Socratic philosopher, he proposed a very primitive notion of natural selection, which Plato here rejects, right? And that's because if forms, all the familiar forms of nature that we come to know happened just by blind forces of selection, that is natural selection, where no real thought or choice is at work, then that means everything just happens randomly. And there would be no reason for anything to do what it does. And so on this basis, Plato and Aristotle will follow him in his own biological treatises, like the Parts of Animals, rejects evolutionary theory in favor of a teleological account. So teleology is, and we'll talk about this when we get to Aristotle in a few minutes, is the study of purposes or ends. And so you might be familiar with Christian creationism. That idea as a kind of opposition to Darwinian natural selection is grounded ultimately in Aristotelian biological or teleological biology. The idea that each species is marked by one form, which is a natural kind, which is driven by some fundamental purpose, which was first conceived in the mind of the divinity, of the God. And so you can probably see how this would have been very influential on Christian doctrine. So in the Middle Ages, Aristotelian, that is pagan, Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics and epistemology was not perfectly, but strongly wedded with Christian theology, right? And so through the work of figures like St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages and St. Augustine too. Okay, so I noticed there's something in the chat. Was natural selection blind after it created eyes? Yeah, what do you mean by that, Owen?
I just thought of it and I thought it was funny, so I put it in the chat. But it is an interesting like rabbit hole that I don't think quite applies all the way to the conversation at hand. But I think that on a certain level, natural selection is carried out by its participants in a sort of like fractalized way where none of us quite have like power over it, but we do have a say in that our choices and the results of those choices impact the overall scheme. And so once we had eyes, well, that changed the game. And I wonder if it led to more complex and successful varieties of life forms.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also to connect to Aristotle's biology. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes in detail, but one thing that distinguishes animal life, and Aristotle would consider humans animals, unlike certain modern thinkers oriented to Christian doctrine. But for Aristotle, humans are animals, and what distinguishes animals from plants, one thing that distinguishes animals from plants is the capacity for perception. And Aristotle argues And this is still embraced to this day by scientists. So he had some profound insight into some things. He argues that every animal, insofar as it is an animal, necessarily is endowed with perceptual sense, necessarily can perceive, but not all animals can perceive in the same way. So some animals have different senses, but there has to be one foundational sense that every animal has as animal, and that, for Aristotle, is the touch, tactility. And that's interesting because even single-celled organisms, if you're able to, through whatever means, under a microscope, prod or goad them in some manner, they will respond, right? They will react to it. So all animal life as sensory or perceptual life builds up from the ground of touch or tactility. And then he thinks that the highest of all the senses would be the visual sense. So that's just an example of how, for some reason, and there are real reasons for this, in the entire history of the Western intellectual tradition, the sense of sight above all others has been privileged as the most important. So in his Metaphysics, Aristotle begins that book called the Metaphysics with all human beings by nature, that is by phusis, desire to know. We have this innate desire to know things, to learn things. And he says, this is why human beings take delight in their eyes above all other senses, even if they're not getting anything in particular out of seeing at a certain moment. So you take pleasure in just looking at things, even if it's not going to grant you any more power or wealth or whatever. So yeah, thanks. That was just an interesting aside that we'll build on in a few minutes. Okay. And so there's two more things to work through to get to my mimesis here. So now, continuing on that method of division, what shall we say of human art? And what is the human art? It's techne. Do we not make one house by the art of building and another by the art of drawing, which is a sort of dream created by man for those who are awake? And I mentioned that last time, but I really love that way that Plato has the stranger present the nature of perhaps visual depictions, so visual art. A painting of a house is like a dream created by a human for those who are awake. So it's as if while perceiving the representation of a house or a horse or another human body, you are engaged in a kind of dream or fantasy even while waking. And then the method of division continues further. So the human creative art is divisible into two kinds. Building, as when a carpenter makes a house. So this kind of endeavor is concerned with the thing, so the end result of the production. And then two, imitating, as when a painter depicts an image of a house. And this kind of act is concerned not with the thing, not with the house that you could live in, but with the image of the thing. And so then, two, imitating is the proper province of what we're calling art, art as such. And that principally involves imitation or mimesis, because we wouldn't call a carpenter an artist in the same sense as we would refer to a painter who gives us a representation, a visual representation of a house. So now, from thousands of years before, we're getting a little bit closer to a more familiar idea of what separates art from non-art. And then this is the conclusion. And so I'm really just glossing over and trying to build an important picture of the nature of art from a Platonic point of view from this strange comment on the part of or question on the part of the stranger. The stranger says, there are some who imitate knowing what they imitate, and some who do not know. So that is some who imitate not knowing what they imitate. And what line of distinction can there possibly be greater than that which divides ignorance from knowledge? So does anyone have, I kind of give my interpretation here. But did that strike anyone in some different way that you'd like to share with us? Or what is the stranger meaning by that? Can you maybe put it in your own words?
Comes to mind when I hear that is trying to imitate a feeling that you can't quite hold on to. And I thought of Pink Floyd on The Dark Side of the Moon. There's like this epic vocal solo, which to me is always represented like death. I think it's either right before part of the song called "The Great Gig in the Sky" about death, and if you listen to it, it's like horrified at one part, and then the ending of the solo is very peaceful and beautiful, and so it feels like it's trying to touch on something that you can't experience and be aware of experiencing it. So it's an imitation of something that's beyond experience.
So in the case of Pink Floyd with that solo, would that be an example of those who are imitating and knowing what they imitate, or I think you're saying that they are not knowing what they're imitating?
Yeah, I think it's trying to imitate something that you don't know. But yeah, I don't know, like using what you do know to try and imitate what you don't, and trying to put something that's inconceivable into some conceivable art form.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, yeah, that's interesting. Any other ideas on that?
I'm trying to come up with in my head a musician or a group of musicians who are like the exact opposite of Pink Floyd. And all I can guess is just any pianist. like you know, taking the sheet music and like knowing every bit of the theory from all these different angles. Might be a more Techne focused, knowledge-based approach to the creative art of music. Whereas Pink Floyd, like I think they have like unlocked the soul of music down, especially that solo. There's no words in that solo, and you don't need words for that solo. And likewise, you don't really need words to appreciate Beethoven or Mozart, but you kind of need the sheet music, and that's the bar for entry for that music. But you can sort of listen and maybe not imitate super well, but you can listen to Pink Floyd and just like, like, ah, and that's all you really need. You don't need the sheet music.
Good, without, knowing exactly what the technical sources of the sound that you're enjoying are, or the compositional or notational structure at work. So the enjoyment is somehow divorced from that, but not necessarily. And so would that be an example of ignorant imitation then? And for that reason, might Plato look down on it?
I think he would look down on Pink Floyd.
Yeah, I think he would too. So yeah, this is kind of my take, my interpretation of this, and this is a nice transitional point to get us into Aristotle's theory, who's really building on what Plato laid out before. So think of so here I am in this part of the text. So think of a playwright, a screenwriter, a novelist, a songwriter. So we're talking about music here, who creates maybe a kind of story in which the characters are disposed to present to us different virtues or bad behaviors of which individuals are capable. And so in this case, the artist, whether we're talking about a screenwriter, a novelist, a storyteller, a poet, they are imitating the form. So remember what eidos means in Plato's theory. So if you have, for example, a courageous person, and there's a story about that person, the writer of the story is somehow trying to capture the form of courage and to give us a picture of that through the illustration of the personage or the character, right? And so not everyone, though, has perfect or even adequate knowledge of these forms, as we've perhaps come to recognize through the Ladder of Love account, that maybe even Socrates isn't destined, as Diotima told him at a young age, to achieve the absolute form of beauty. It's something that's achieved only rarely and through great struggle and difficulty. So not everyone is able to understand, that is, has true knowledge of these forms of courage, self-control, generosity, compassion, and so forth. And so artists who lack knowledge of these forms, even though they're trying to represent these forms through whatever medium, end up giving birth, because remember, all poiesis is giving birth in beauty. They end up giving birth to deformed works. So notice how deformed, the D there is a qualification, a negative qualification of form. Deformed works. And so deformed works are, in other words, ugly, but they might not be ugly as visual, as a visual quality or characteristic, but ugly in a moral sense, right? And so presenting these deformed characters, if we take this and connect it to the ion, where the poet is like an iron ring or magnet that attracts the rhapsode, who attracts the spectator, who attracts their friends, and so forth. If you're dealing with a deformed magnet, then you're going to be drawing all these souls to deformation itself. And thus you're giving them a corrupted picture of the very truths that you're trying to communicate or express or articulate. So then that would make these deformed works of art unethical. And so since only a relatively small number of individuals have true knowledge of the forms, it follows that most works of art and the artists who produced them are morally problematic. And this is why Plato has the reputation, and we didn't read this, but it is included in our textbook, the selections from the Republic, perhaps Plato's most famous influential dialogue. Well, in book 10 of the Republic, he argues that the poets should be kicked out of the beautiful city precisely for these reasons, that is, of the ideal perfect community, because they can end up corrupting individuals. And so this is also why Plato famously places the arts below philosophy and science. So philosophy and science are understood interchangeably here, because the philosopher is one who knows the true forms, or at least desires to pursue the truth of the forms, whereas artists will often imitate blindly, thinking they have an adequate apprehension of the forms, but they really have a perception of a deformed instance of the forms, and then that's what they end up producing and circulating, and then that becomes a kind of point of influence by which other artists create maybe even more deformed versions, until you have an entirely deformed society. Right? And so that's where Plato takes the danger of the arts to be, which means, and this is something we talked about at the very beginning of our discussion of Plato, that like logos, art is characterizable in the terms of the pharmakon. And so pharmakon is the word from which we get pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. But in the Greek, it's ambiguous. It means at the same time poison and cure. So it's an ambiguous power that can kill you or cure you, depending upon the context, right? So you take a little bit of medicine, you're good to go. You take a lot of that medicine, you're dead. And that speaks to the ambiguous power of the medicinal arts. And here Plato is telling us about the ambiguous power of the fine arts, as we might call them, that they can attune us to the ultimate beauties and goodness of the world, but they can just as easily, or perhaps more easily, put us into a deformed attunement with reality. Okay. So does that make sense? you have any comments or questions about that? So does it make sense how Plato's theory is mimetic? So it's based on imitation in some way. That the artists in poiesis, in bringing forth whatever it is that they're creating, are in whatever way imitating some form, but as all human beings are, artists too are for the most part deficient in their perception of the forms. That is because the forms are not available for sensory apprehension. They are not sensible, that is graspable by the senses. Rather, they are intelligible. In other words, only graspable by the reason or intellect. Okay, so that's the important thing to take away from Plato, and also what we spent a lot of time on last time. So the undecidability of the primacy of techne, so art as knowledge, which is always knowledge of forms prior to their imitation in this or that material medium. So that's one part of the tension. And the other side is the sort of divine madness, such that artists can be gripped by this powerful inspiration from some unperceivable place, out of absence, out of the locus of mystery, you might say, that puts us beside ourselves, that drives us mad. And so this is a tension to take from Plato that we'll return to periodically as we walk through these later versions of aesthetic theory. Okay, so any final questions on Plato before we take a break? No? All right, cool. So if some comments or questions are pressing, they come up, just feel free. But let's take a quick break, just 5 minutes or so. So we'll meet back here at 2:35, and then we'll jump into Aristotle. All right, so I'll pause the recording here. All right, I hope we're back. So also assigned for today was the first chapter, so past the introduction, but the first chapter of the Gorilla Girls book. So I'm hoping for those who at this point have been able to acquire that text that you did the reading. It's very short. So we will be reading this entire book, unlike our primary text. We will be reading this entire book, finishing it up at the end. So in week 9 or 10, we'll finish up the last chapter. But before we get into Aristotle, was there anything interesting that you guys wanted to talk about or ask about from that first chapter?
It's pretty funny. I got the book today.
Oh, cool, good.
I was reading it, and my wife was like, "What are you guys learning in school these days?"
And she's probably a little unhappy with your answer, right?
We're learning about toxic homoerotic relationships across the centuries being the dominant force in our artistic expression.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's to some extent quite true. But yeah, so this is, again, this isn't a philosophical text. It's a work in art history, and it's supposed to be fun and enjoyable and not too dense or overwhelming. And so we will read a chapter when it's appropriate, as it's associated with the historical time of the theory that we're discussing. So it's relevant for this week, given that we're engaging with Aristotle and also, as we've done so far today, Plato. But the first chapter also covers the subsequent Roman period. So beyond the Hellenic period, what's known as the Hellenistic period, which includes the Greek-speaking peoples and also the Latin people-speaking peoples of the Roman Empire. And so just looking at some of the quotes from Aristotle, this is from his Politics. It's absurd to argue from an analogy with wild animals and say that men and women ought to engage in the same occupations, for animals do not do housework. Right? It's almost like Aristotle is he's like Andrew Dice Clay or something, right? Like giving you a controversial zinger there but he's completely serious, right? So in the Politics, that's where we get infamously Aristotle's justification of what he calls natural slavery, that some individuals are born of an inferior, that is slavish or slave-like nature, and it's for that reason in their best interest to be enslaved because they don't have the capacities to live as free individuals. And so there's a kind of paternalism here, whereby the master who is in possession of the slave is in possession of that slave, not only for their own interests, but for carrying out the interests of the slave herself or himself, or the enslaved person, I should say, to be more accurate. Although for Aristotle, they would be slaves in themselves. But this wasn't connected to any conception of race. It should be pointed out, since race did not exist. Race is really a product of the 15th century, probably. So race didn't exist. And so there were Greeks who were enslaved simply because of the way their nature was somehow assessed. It's fairly mysterious what the mechanism for that determination would be. But as you see in our reading, and I have one of the prompts for the discussion forum this week connected to this as well, where he says, you know, dealing with a slave or a woman, one is inferior and the other is a wholly worthless being. It's somewhat ambiguous in that expression, which is which. If the woman is wholly worthless or the slave is wholly worthless. But in any case, in the Politics, Aristotle argues that the woman has a particular role, one with which we're all unfortunately familiar, I'm sure, this sort of cliched masculinism, whereby the woman is supposed to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, right? So that's the appropriate place for the woman in Aristotle's account. And it's only the man who is capable of having one foot in the home as the master of the domestic sphere, the oikos from the Greek. Oikos is house or home, and then another foot in the public domain, whereby they can participate, for example, in democracy, in war, or whatever else. And by the way, it's in the Politics that we get the first theoretical articulation of economics, economic theory. And that's precisely where that term comes, oikos nomos, so law of the home, or in other words, household management is the term for economics. And so we get that too from Aristotle. So built into all of these disciplines, Aristotle masterfully was entangled in the development of all of them from the very beginning here. So metaphysics, biology, physics, economics, politics, art. We find then traces of sexism built into all of that because of the legacy of Aristotle. So to a large extent, that's what we're dealing with and working through today. So one important thing to comment, and this is on the very first page of that chapter, so still dealing with this book, on page 11, the Guerrilla Girls write at that last paragraph on the bottom of the page, despite our veneration of classical art as the embodiment of classical values, art and artists were not very important in the Greek social structure. Art, because of the physical labor involved, wasn't considered an intellectual activity. The most famous Greek writers did not accord visual artists anywhere near the status given to musicians and poets. Still, it was forbidden for any slave, male or female, to be taught to paint. And that's really important, and that's a part of one of the prompts I give you guys. And we'll talk about that on Thursday, so I don't want to dig into that. But one thing to notice here is the Greeks would associate the manual labor involved in building a statue or a painting even with slavishness, with a slave-like character. And so for Aristotle, education, higher education, is largely about an activity labeled scholazein. And it's that Greek word from which we get, and I'll just type that into the chat. So that's a verb in the Greek, meaning to engage in leisure, right? And it's the word from which we get scholastic and eventually school. So our English word for school derives from scholazein, which means leisurely activity. Isn't that strange? Considering, you know, how horrible school is, I'm thinking of like the public education system. I, for one, didn't enjoy going to high school. I skipped classes through most of my high school experience because it was anything but leisurely. But from the Greek point of view, education was your opportunity to free yourself from the constraints and misery of manual labor. The kind of labor that's required to keep yourself going, that is in growing food, building a house, preparing clothes for yourself, or the labor that's required to keep a society going. And it's because of this distinction that philosophy as such was able to arise in history, because certain members of a society didn't have to do that work, so they were freed from the difficulty of manual labor to just contemplate, to just think about the nature of reality. And that's what school is supposed to be. And so the opposite of scholazein is ascholazein, which is like work, busyness. So it's through contemplation, which we participate in education, that we are really pulled out of time and space, and we're able to commune with the ultimate divine perspective, because God is precisely the being that is unbeholden to the material necessities of doing work and so forth. Okay. And so for that reason, artistic production in the areas of like sculpture and so forth would be perceived as slave-like to some extent. Although the Greeks would have, as we see through Aristotle, would have great respect for well-trained and sophisticated, adept craftsmen, right? As a sexist, though, he would think that women would be less capable of that. So there's this layer of sexism that's involved in all of this. Okay, so any thoughts about that? And we'll talk about this more on Thursday. Okay. So I'm going to jump in to the reading guide for Aristotle, and we will have to continue this a bit, but we'll allow our presenters to go first next time, and then we'll just kind of carry on our discussion from there. So there's the image of Aristoteles, or Aristotle, as we call him in English. And who was this guy? Well, here are his dates. Dates of his life. He was Plato's most famous and influential student, having studied with Plato at the academy he inaugurated, the first university. He went on to found his own university, the Lyceum, which lasted 200 years, and then it was finally destroyed by the marauding Roman general Sulla. At a certain point later, after running this Lyceum in Athens, he was employed at the court of King Philip II of Macedon, so north of Athens, to educate his son Alexander, who you might know as Alexander the Great, would eventually come to conquer much of the world as it was known by the Greeks. And Aristotle was so profoundly important, so hugely influential a figure that the medieval and Renaissance commentators, scholars, and scribes knew him simply as the philosopher. So if you referred to the philosopher, everyone around would know who you're talking about. They would know you mean Aristotle. And how far-reaching is his influence? Well, I mentioned this briefly a few moments ago, but he developed groundbreaking theories in very diverse areas: metaphysics, physics, logic. So the system of logic that Aristotle codified for us was virtually unchanged until like the 19th century, so the 1800s or so. That's how long it endured. Ethics, psychology, biology, theology, even meteorology, political science, economics, and then of course for us, aesthetics. And these are theories that continue to shape and also determine what is possible in our world in far-reaching ways. And they would, for that reason, be theories with which you're already familiar, insofar as there are traces of them throughout our various cultural institutions. Even if you don't know the name Aristotle, you certainly know the products of his thought. And some of the most famous products of his thought, and we'll talk about these today, Hilomorphisms. So this is the theory that every existing thing, not simply living things, every existing thing is a composite or a synthesis of matter and form. So some of you might have heard that idea before. And then teleology, and I mentioned this earlier today, the study of ends or purposes. So his teleological approach, which is most famously perhaps preserved and controversially still preserved in biology, holds that every natural thing develops and operates in accordance with some purpose or function. Telos, that's where we get teleology. And so telos is that for the sake of which the organism grows and operates at all. And it would be apprehended in the divine consciousness. So in God's mind, prior to realization in any material thing as an existing example of this or that species. So briefly, Aristotle is what we refer to as a systematic philosopher, and there will be other systematic philosophers we'll talk about next week. Immanuel Kant was another systematic philosopher. Hegel was perhaps the most absolutely to the point of almost craziness, you might say, systematic philosopher. And we'll discuss Hegel the week after Kant. And so this means that there is a specific place in his overarching philosophical view for various subject matters which get shaped up largely by the efforts of Aristotle, influenced by Plato, into these particular disciplines. So metaphysics, logic, ethics, rhetoric, politics, etc. And each area of study or mode of inquiry, in having its own particular place, is related to others and differentiable by these four criteria. So we can differentiate, say, metaphysics from logic, from ethics, from politics, from rhetoric. We can separate all of these fields of inquiry by one, the source or capacity in the soul that makes that very discipline or inquiry possible. Two, the kind of activity, state of mind, or attitude in which you actually carry out that inquiry. So what is your state of mind or activity in which you are pursuing, say, the focus of logic or ethics or art? And then three, what that activity itself makes possible. So if it makes possible some further state of mind or some deeper understanding. And then lastly, what it is good for, what its purpose is for, beyond itself. And so this is where we get telos, the very end for which anything is carried out. And so it's very important, and this is why I'm providing so much background here. It's very important that we understand at least the rudiments, the basic elements of Aristotle's overarching system to adequately grasp what he's doing in the Poetics. That is to say, what he's up to in terms of placing art within this system as a whole. And so that's why we have to work through some of these difficult ideas. Okay. So this is a kind of a grid visual model by which to locate, to place all four of those criteria vis-a-vis the various arts or disciplines or areas of study can be defined and also distinguished from one another, can be placed in relief from one another. So this is how to read this chart. So these three would be what I talked about in terms of one. So the primary source or capacity within the soul. And so dunamis, which I've written here, a transliteration from the Greek dunamis, it means a couple of things, as we'll see. It means potentiality, and that's usually what it gets translated in, or potential. And it also means capacity or ability to do something. And so that's what the various layers or capacities of our soul make possible. And then here, you've got the 2, 3, and 4, so the remaining criteria. And then using these criteria in accordance with the various sources located or housed in the soul, that in fact make up the soul in terms of what it is, we get answers to these criteria or ways to fill them in. So one primary capacity that we have as rational animals, so to speak, is noesis, or thought. And when we put our noesis, our intellect, our thought to work, we can engage in the practice or activity of theoria. And that's the word from which we get theoretical or theory in English. And that means to view something, as we say in English, objectively, or in other words, closer to the Greek way of perceiving things, like a spectator. So think of theoretical knowledge in this sense as spectatorial knowledge. So if you're watching, say, a baseball game on television, you're watching it as a spectator, and there's nothing that you can do in your activity of viewing the game that will change the game. You're not participating in it in that sense. Your perception of it, your consciousness of it, can't transform it. And similarly, what happens in that game isn't going to affect you in any profound way, unless, of course, you've betted all of your money on it or something like that. But in general, that's not how spectatorial engagement works. And so paradigmatic of this kind of activity for Aristotle would be contemplating the planets, the heavenly bodies. So whatever knowledge you're able to develop of the planet Jupiter, it's not going to change Jupiter. And Jupiter is not going to, in your knowledge of it, change you, right? And that's because in dealing with the objects proper for theoretical inquiry, we're dealing with eternal objects. So God would be another great candidate for theoretical activity or engagement. Okay. And so I have in yellow here the kind of study or the kind of science that is given rise to or given support to in virtue of this kind of activity, which is possible because of this kind of capacity that we have. So if you engage in theoria over a long enough period of time and consistently, you can develop episteme, which is knowledge, but it's qualified as scientific knowledge or theoretical knowledge. So it's what we would now in the 21st century, for example, characterize as scientific knowledge. And then if you engage in scientific inquiry, study over a consistent and sufficiently long period, then you might develop Sophia, which is philosophical wisdom. It's a kind of general wisdom of reality itself and one's place in it. And so now, well, why do you want to develop Sophia or philosophical wisdom? What is it good for? What does it enable? Well, nothing in particular. Aristotle thinks it's good in itself. We desire episteme through theoretical engagement with the realities of our world because we desire, as humans, most naturally to know things. And we derive a certain pleasure from knowing things, even if those points of knowledge aren't immediately useful or pragmatic for us. Okay, but this isn't so much what we're concerned with in this class, but I'm laying this out so that you can see his system as a whole so that we have a sense of where art falls in it. But we also have this capacity of aesthesis. So we've talked about that already. That means sense perception. So putting to work our 5 sense modalities. But in addition to aesthesis, as animals, we have orexis, which is desire or appetite. And in addition to that, animals are also capable of mobility or locomotion, moving from one place to another. So through aesthesis, I perceive a sandwich at the other end of the room. Through orexis, I experience the desire for food, that is, I'm hungry. And then through my power of mobility, I can move in place from where I am now to that sandwich to get it to satisfy my desire. And so those are the important dimensions that mark animal life. And so if you add time to that, so if you take perception, desire, and then you add time to that, you get experience, the word for which is empiria. And this is why in English we have words like empirical or empiricism. So empirical truth would be a truth that can be verified through sense experience, right? And so experience, drawing from aesthesis, so sense perception, desire, we can participate in the study of ethics or political science. Because here we're not dealing with, as spectators do, enduring phenomena that aren't changed or affected by our perception and that don't affect us either. Unlike that, when it comes to ethics, we are always a part of the very thing we're investigating. So if we want to figure out what to do in terms of doing the right thing, what's morally good, what's morally right, well, that's obviously going to affect who we are and the kind of experience of the world, and it's going to affect the world. So if you decide, because you need to get out of some financial difficulty, to rob somebody, well, that's going to, and you're trying to figure out whether that's acceptable, whether that's a good action, well, the conclusion that you arrive at, unlike any conclusion that you arrive at about the sun or about God or about Jupiter, is going to affect your life, and it's going to affect the lives of others. And furthermore, the kind of knowledge we can derive here is what current philosophers, modern philosophers, would refer to as a posteriori knowledge versus a priori knowledge. Can anyone explain that distinction? Anyone who's taken another philosophy class?
I think it had something to do with knowing through experience or knowing through some other form of learning.
Yeah, so a priori is Latin for prior to. Prior to what? Well, as Donnie just said, prior to experience. So a great example of a priori knowledge would be mathematical knowledge. So 2 + 2 = 4. I know that that's true in a way that's independent of experience. So whenever I want to verify the truth of the sentence 2 + 2 = 4, I don't have to pick up 2 things here and 2 things here and say, oh yeah, okay, that's right, 2 + 2 = 4. If 2 + 2 = 4 is true, it's true now, it's true on the surface of the moon, it was true 1,000 years ago, and it'll be true 1,000 years in the future. And it doesn't require experience to verify it. But when it comes to ethical truths, we need to know the concrete details on the ground that define or bring into relief the very event or object that we're evaluating. So for example, everyone can agree that murder is wrong or bad. Well, at least I hope everyone can agree with that. But a question will arise, is this particular act an instance of murder? And that requires investigation. That's why we have detectives, right? You have to figure out if the action was actually murder, if it was an accident, or if it was self-defense, or if it was in some appropriate context like the battlefield, and that requires experience. So it has to be known only a posteriori, that is, through experience. And for that reason, Aristotle argues that ethics is a messy business. You can't expect precision or exactness when it comes to answering ethical questions in the same way that you can with mathematics or a priori truths. So if you practice ethics enough based on your experience, but you also need thought, right? So in this way, think of, and this is why I put noesis over here, because diagonally, let's say noesis has a role to play. It runs through all of this in this diagonal fashion. So it's not just experience. You actually also have to put thought to work. And if you do that, then you get phronesis, or practical wisdom, which allows you to make good decisions in a variety of different situations. And why do you want to develop phronesis, or practical wisdom? Well, because that will enable you to make good actions, right? To do right things. So we learn ethics or political science for Aristotle in order to arrive at good actions, good praxis. So praxis is the Greek word for English, which is preserved in many English language contexts, such as in Marxian theory. So Karl Marx, for example, as a kind of Aristotelian, he was very much influenced by Aristotle, talks about praxis a lot. Okay, and then lastly, we can find techne, and that arises precisely from the same sources as does ethics. So because we have sense experience, we have desires, we have needs, and we experience the world through the fabric or the dimensions of these capacities, then we're capable of techne, the productive arts. And what does techne make possible? Well, poiesis. So you learn the techne of cooking, and now you can create, you can produce good food, good, tasty, nutritious food. And so why do you want poiesis? Well, what is the end result? Well, it's this or that produced good or object. So if you're a house builder, that end will be a house. If you're a shoemaker, the end will be shoes. If you're a poet, the end will be a poem. If you're a painter, the end will be a painting, and so forth. Okay. So does this system make sense? Are there any questions about this? Okay. And then this is the last point in terms of some important background information. So this is the structure of the soul, or psyche, according to Aristotle. So soul, as I think I mentioned before, means two things. First of all, source of life. So Plato argues in the dialogue Phaedo that the definition of death is precisely the separation of soul from body. So that means when you have the combination of soul and body, you have life. So the presence of a soul and a body is simply what endows that body with life. What separates the non-living or the inorganic from the living. And then secondly, based on that first order capacity, the capacity for life, it's what gives us various other capacities, or in the Greek, duname. So whatever an ensouled thing can do. So for the Greeks, every living thing, so any entity insofar as it is alive, has a soul. In other words, it is ensouled. Ensoukan is the Greek. And so what are the kinds of life? Well, there are plants, animals, and humans, and they're all differentiable by virtue of the capacities that each layer of soul gives them. So there is psyche threptike, the vegetative soul or plant-like soul, and that's responsible for automatic functions. So this is the sense in which humans are like plants. So our hair grows without our volition, our organs process, our metabolism works. As children, we grow into adults. Our skin cells are replaced every 7, or our cells in general are replaced every 7 years, and so forth. And all of this happens without our conscious control or awareness. And so that's the sense in which plants operate on the basis of photosynthesis, right? Which is not anything volitional. It's not anything purposeful in a intentional manner. And then, so animals, so you see this box here, animals exemplify the sensitive soul. And that soul contains, it houses the plant soul. So animals are necessarily plant-like too, but plants are not necessarily animal-like too. And so, as I was describing earlier, suke aesthetique is the sensitive soul, or the sensible, the soul that's capable of sensation or sense experience. It's irrational, just like, well, similarly to the vegetative soul. The vegetative soul is non-rational, and you can't exert any intellectual effort to control it. So you can't really change your metabolism simply by thinking. But the irrational aspect of the sensitive soul is a bit different. But in any case, I'll talk about that in a second, but it's responsible for sense perception, as I said, desire, so orexis, appetite, and also locomotion, movement from one place to another. And then lastly, the human soul, you can see this box, it contains the animal soul, which for its part contains the vegetative soul. It's the rational soul as responsible for two functions. A, for controlling desires. So in one way, the noetic or intellectual soul turns back on the animal soul within it and subjects it to constraint. So whereas a hungry animal will just immediately start devouring any food-like thing that's in front of it to overcome the pain of hunger, a human being can decide, however hungry they might be, not to eat. So this is why there are examples of people engaged in hunger strikes for social justice reasons. That is, for some intellectual purpose, you can constrain your desires. You can subject them to the authority of your intellect. So that's the first aspect of the suke noetike, the rational soul. The second is engaging in that activity that we call theoria, which again is conducted for its own pleasure, its own sake. So sometimes we're not using our intellect just to control our desires. We can also use our intellect to contemplate, in this kind of Platonic sense, the perfect forms that constitute reality. So humans have all three souls, animals have one and two, and plants have only one. And so this means every human is at the same time, as human, both an animal and a plant, which I think is pretty fucking cool. And maybe you agree, I don't know. So does this make sense? These ideas?
Yeah, definitely.
Any questions about this so far?
Is it part of the function of a rational soul to start trying to ask about its own soul?
Yeah, that's a
That
good
seems like what this, it's like weird because it's like a meta indication of the fact that a rational soul was here, that there's a chart about rational souls.
Yeah, exactly. This is a stamp that marks the presence of noesis, of rationality, or of intellect. And what is intellect in its most profound essence for Aristotle? Well, we can find that by looking to the figure of God, of theos, of the divine. For Aristotle, God is, and this is how he defines God in the metaphysics, and also in the work from which I'm drawing this, De Anima, on the nature of the soul. He argues that God is precisely thought, so noesis, thought thinking itself. Thought thinking itself. And what the hell does that mean? What does it mean to say that God is the being which is just thought thinking itself? Well, it's a little confusing, but Aristotelian perceptual theory, so dealing with the sensitive soul, which endows us with perception. So when I perceive this book that's sitting in front of me, and this will make more sense once we work through the next slides. But when I perceive this book in front of me, I am perceiving, when I recognize it as a book. So think of Plato's theory here. What am I doing? Well, I am recognizing the form of bookness, which connects this book to this book and allows me to say, although they're different, they're in some essential way the same. They're the same as books. So when I perceive this book, I recognize its book-like form. That form shows up as visible for me, available for recognition by my eyes, because it takes form, it takes shape within some materials, in this case, paper, right? So perceptually, I'm able to perceive the form as inhering in some material substratum, some material basis. And really interestingly, for Aristotle, when I do that, in some sense, some important sense, when perceiving the book, when recognizing its form, I become the book. You are identified with it. You, in some way, become the very objects that you perceive, because their form takes shape in your consciousness. And in that way, you're identified with them. But now let's think about thinking. So I leave the room. I no longer have this book in front of me, but I can think about it. I'm not perceiving it anymore. So what am I doing when I'm thinking about it? Well, in thinking about the book, I have somehow abstracted the pure form of bookness from its material presence. So the paper that makes up this book that I can pick up and pass to others and read, when I look at it, it's not crammed into my head or my eyes. It's only the visual form that gets in my head. So when I think about the book, I'm able to think about the pure form without any material. So when we define God as thought thinking itself, that means that God is the being that is thinking of every possible form that can ever exist, that can ever take shape in any material thing, but as abstracted from all materiality. And God is thinking every such form simultaneously. So think about a blank piece of paper. So on a blank piece of paper, there is potentially every form that any artist could ever doodle on it. But you decide to doodle something, you have now actualized what was there potentially. So if you transfer this idea of the sheet of paper to represent your consciousness or your mind, and think about God as a mind or consciousness, God is thinking of every one of those potential forms that's on that piece of paper, but at the same time and infinitely, eternally. So I can think of all kinds of forms, but I can only think of a few of them at once. And then I have to do other things like eat, brush my teeth, go to sleep, or whatever. But God is just thinking all of these forms constantly. And so when we think the forms, beautifully, this idea, we somehow attune ourselves within these different moments, which are always destined to fall away and give way to other moments. But within these moments of thinking, we participate in divinity. We share in the life of God. We somehow attune ourselves to that fundamental layer of reality. Okay. Does that make sense? So this maybe is starting to resonate with you in ways that are relevant to thinking about art, right? So then the human artist is conceived of analogically, that is by analogy in this sense, to the divine craftsman. You think a thought, you think an idea, and you want to bring that idea to realization. And so in that effort, as an artist, you are approximating the divine creativity that we talked about earlier today in the context of Plato when talking about divine poiesis. So now defining techne. So this is really what we're talking about. And we have just a couple minutes left. So the kind of knowledge we're dealing with is techne, that is productive knowledge. But recall that techne relies on the soul's capacities primarily for perception and desire. We achieve it through experience. So think about how artists rely on trial and error, right? So you'll try something out through experience. It won't work exactly how you want it. So then you'll make another effort differently. It facilitates production, building, or making. So it's through techne that we produce, build, or make things. And it's learned for the sake of producing different goods. So we have a techne for house making, a techne for food making, a techne for health making, what physicians do, what doctors do, weapon making, poetry, sculpture, furniture design, and so forth. And so in book 2 of chapter 8 of his work, The Physics, which is actually included in our textbook on page 87, so I'm kind of summarizing these things for you so you don't have to read them, which investigates natural things. So the Physics is a book which investigates natural things to the extent that they're natural. Aristotle writes, and I quote, "And generally techne partly completes what nature," so physis, "cannot bring to a finish, and partly imitates," so the verb there is mimetai, "her. If therefore artificial," so technetos is the adjective for artificial, "if therefore artificial products are for the sake of a telos, some end, so clearly also are natural products." So nature produces her ends, whether humans, animals, plants, minerals, the stars, or whatever. Nature produces her ends as a telos, that is, for some end state for the sake of which the whole process was undertaken from the start. And on the basis of this, Aristotle thinks so do artists. So artists as artists involved in techne are imitating the productive powers of nature. And so what does this tell us about productive knowledge? That is techne. So we're out of time, but I'll just wrap up with this few sentences here. Well, nature is not only poietic, but it is autopoietic. So some of you might have heard that term. It's used in contemporary discourses in English still, autopoiesis. So self-produced, self-made. So nature contains the principle of production within itself. On the other hand, techne imitates nature by following its poietic powers. But techne completes or perfects nature by making up for its shortcomings. So for example, human beings can learn how to produce shoes, which other animals, like animals with hooves, for example, don't need to. So they have these sort of natural hooves to protect their feet. Humans don't have that. So we imitate nature, which does produce hooves for non-human animals. And we also complete nature. We bring it to its beautiful end or fruition. So through this production, we repair the state of vulnerability in which nature left us at our birth, leaving us very sensitive to the environment, allowing us to better achieve our own end or purpose. And for Aristotle, and he teaches us this in the Ethics, the fundamental purpose for all humans, what we all desire, even if we have disagreements about what this means, we all want to be happy. So it's by pursuing techne, the productive arts, that we can achieve happiness in a way that nature didn't naturally equip us. Okay. All right, so I'll stop sharing and we'll leave it there. So this stuff is, pretty dense. That's why I have to talk a lot more than I would like to, but hopefully this kind of background helped you understand the reading And we'll continue with this on Thursday, but we'll get started with the presenters in case you guys want to talk at all about the reading assigned for today. And then we'll dig into the poetics, which will be much easier to grasp now that we've had a lot of this background. And there's still a little more background to go, but are there any final questions or anything before we go? I'm sorry to keep you a few minutes after, but. All right, guys, so hang in there, and I'm looking forward to Thursday to continuing this conversation, and hope you have a good week. So I'll see you guys then.
Thank you, Professor. Take care.
Yep.